Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's doing great on this Monday of homecoming week. I'm Nicole. I'm with the athletics department as well as the foundation, and I wanted to welcome everyone to our 3 o'clock HU talk with Dr. Peter Linder. If you live in the Las Vegas area, we're hopeful that we'll see you later this week for a few different events. We have the Cowboy Lounge, which is Friday night, and those are $20 tickets online for a fantastic silent and live auction. And then, of course, Saturday we kick off with the 5K in the morning. If you're interested in running a 5K, please definitely register online as well for that event. And then, of course, we have our Cowboys football game at noon, and then the volleyball team is also playing Saturday night at 6. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Peter Linder and give you a little bit of history on our wonderful professor. He's originally from Los Alamos. He's currently a professor of history, serving as the interim dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. He has been a member of the New Mexico Highlands faculty for the last 27 years and has taught courses in Latin American history, New Mexico and Southwest history, Western civilization, and historiography. He received his BA and MA from the University of New Mexico and his PhD in Latin American history from the University of Texas at Austin. Most of Dr. Linder's research focuses on Western Venezuela, particularly in the Maracaibo region. He is currently working on a project dealing with Spanish indigenous relations in the Maracaibo region in the 1700s and early 1800s. He is also conducting long-term research on the social history of our beloved city, Las Vegas, and northeastern New Mexico, focusing on social and cultural changes taking place in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His talk today focuses on part of that research. Dr. Linder also received the Steve Wimmer Research Fund in 2023 to pursue research on Protestant teachers in Las Vegas and other communities. So congratulations to Dr. Linder. And I was remiss in my introduction. You see some fantastic interpreters on our Zoom here today. We do have Miss Caitlin Hall and Miss Shelby Lujan, who will also be assisting. So welcome to everyone again. Thank you for being here and interpreting for us, ladies, and Dr. Linder, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, at least for a little while. If I share it for too long, please remind me. I've been told that sometimes I forget. And I should also ask people that if I start to go on a little too long, please give me the sign, because when I get wrought up about my work, I tend to lose track of that. So, okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is an episode in the sort of early 20th century history of Las Vegas, associated with the commemoration of the past. And while this represents some current research, the story that I'm going to tell started actually about 14 years ago. In 2010, I presented a paper at the Historical Society of New Mexico annual meetings dealing with the Centennial celebration held in Las Vegas in 1935. In that Centennial celebration, there was a reenactment from the history of Las Vegas. But fascinatingly to me, what was chosen to be reenacted was not the foundation of the town in 1835 by Nuevo Mexicano settlers coming to Las Vegas Grandes del Rio Gallinas, the big meadows of the Chicken River, in April of 1835. Instead, the planners of the celebration chose to reenact the American occupation of Las Vegas in August of 1846. So I was struck by this, what I thought was a somewhat odd choice of how to observe the 100th anniversary of the town. And this is not just sort of something quaint and isolated from reality. Public celebration and public commemoration of historical events is a way of promoting certain values and a certain view of history. Historical observances often reflect dominant views or interpretations of history, and they can represent attempts to control or shape historical narratives in ways that benefit, in particular, elite groups or the power structure. And so how we remember the past can be a way of exercising power and authority. It can also create arenas for conflict, as we've seen in recent years. So fast forward to the summer of 2024, I was doing some research in the holdings of the History Museum of New Mexico in Santa Fe, and I ran across, while going through the documents related to the Works Progress Administration, a New Deal program that paid, among others, writers and intellectuals for writing, I came across a script for a radio play dealing with the history of Las Vegas. And there's a Highlands connection here. The author or the director of the radio play was a Highlands professor, a man named Lester C. Raines, pictured on the right of the screen. Can everybody see the screen? Everybody see the image? That's Lester C. Raines. He is was a Highlands professor, the head of the English department, but also something of a theatrical impresario and the leader of a theatrical troupe centered at New Mexico Normal University, what is now Highlands University. And so this script for a radio play, which Raines apparently directed, and which he was created under the auspices of the WPA, the Federal Writers Project of the Works Progress Administration, was based on a play intended for public performance, written by another Highlands figure, another Highlands product. This is a woman named Aurora Lucero White, later Aurora Lucero White Lee, pictured in the center here, who was a graduate of Highlands. She went and got certified to teach, later got a bachelor's degree from Highlands, went on to do work at the University of Southern California, came back to Las Vegas, was assistant superintendent and then superintendent of the Las Vegas schools for a while. And from the mid-20s, for a period at least, she was an assistant professor of Spanish at New Mexico Normal University. So she wrote a play titled Carney Takes Las Vegas around 1932. And in 1936, under the direction of Lester Raines, it was turned into a radio play. So that's the focus of today's talk. The radio play itself is a fascinating document. I'm not sure if it was ever performed, although I suspect it was. As early as 1933, Lester Raines' theatrical company, centered at Highlands, a group called the Cocheret Players, Cocheret being sometimes translated as delight makers. It's from Pueblo mythology. But the Cocheret Players, as early as 1933, were putting on one-act radio plays. They were actually broadcasting them from Ilfeld Auditorium, and they would go out on radio networks here in New Mexico, like KGGM, what I guess is now KRQE, and also KOB. So there is this Highlands connection, and that added to its interest. Essentially, the radio play was a kind of romantic dramatization, a kind of fictionalization of the episode in mid-August of 1846, when an American expeditionary force under command of Brigadier General Stephen Watts Kearny arrived in Las Vegas, the first stop in the Mexican territory of New Mexico on the Santa Fe Trail. And as part of the American occupation, Kearny climbed atop a building overlooking the plaza. Today, it's the building that houses La Casa de Música. and he made a famous speech in which he declared New Mexico to be American territory, declared its inhabitants to be American citizens, and as American citizens exempt or freed from any obligation to defend the Mexican Republic, promised them protection and the safeguarding of their rights, but threatened to hang anybody who resisted. So the radio play is a dramatization of that. So a little bit of more background on the radio play. Again, it was produced apparently as part of the Works Progress Administration, which was a New Deal program, a kind of work relief program that was intended to help people survive the Depression by paying them to exercise their professions. Here in New Mexico, and in particular in Las Vegas, there were a lot of WPA projects that were undertaken in the 1930s, including the county courthouse, for example, which was built using WPA money. Here on Highlands campus, there were a number of WPA projects, including Rogers Administration Building, which was initially the library of the university. It was built with WPA money as a WPA project, and even the decorations inside, the famous mural by Lloyd Moylan, The Dissemination of Education in New Mexico, was painted in 1938 under the auspices of the WPA. So again, another Highlands connection. The WPA was active in Las Vegas, and in the person of Lester Raines, work under the WPA as part of the Federal Writers Project was underway. And the radio play is an example of that. Okay, so here is the cover sheet giving us the particulars of the radio play. We see it is for radio use and signed off on by the state director of the Federal Writers Project. And it lists the introduction and authorship as Aurora Lucero, white, again, Spanish professor at Highlands. She eventually got a master's degree at Highlands. I forgot to mention that earlier. So she too is a New Mexico Normal University product. And again, contributed by New Mexico Normal University under direction of Dr. Lester Raines, head of the Department of English. Raines was a thoroughgoing academic, originally from Illinois. He got his undergraduate degree at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana in 1919, received his PhD from the Ohio State University in 1928, and spent about a decade here in New Mexico as a professor and head of the Department of English at New Mexico Normal. Also, he directed the theater company, the Cocheret Players, made up largely of Highland students or normal students, before departing from the university around 1937 and spending apparently most of the rest of his career at the University of Alabama, where he directed their theater program. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. So this is Lester Raines. Again, this is his yearbook photograph. So obviously he looked a little older than this by 1935, 1936. This next to him, of course, this is Aurora Lucero White. And she's a figure who I've seen characterized as an understudied, relatively unknown literary figure in 20th century New Mexico, certainly compared with people better known like Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca, who wrote about life in the Las Vegas area in the late 19th, early 20th century, and Cleofas Jaramillo, who lived on the other side of the mountains and wrote about life in that part of the territory and state at about the same time. Lucero White is well known as an early advocate of suffrage. Here in New Mexico, she actually took part in a demonstration soon after statehood, promoting women's suffrage, much apparently to the disgust of people like Senator Catron, who was not a big fan of the idea of women voting. And she authored a lot of works. Not only was she a prolific playwright, including the radio play, or what became the radio play, but she also collected a lot of folklore and published it. She has a long bibliography of works published dealing with New Mexico history, New Mexico folklore, and customs. Like Cabeza de Vaca and Cleofas Jaramillo, she also embraced the identity of at least elite Nuevo Mexicanas as being essentially Spanish, with a culture almost purely Spanish, something that has become somewhat controversial in later years. All right, on to the radio play. So I'm going to give you a kind of summary of the play. I don't want to go into a great deal of detail, although it is kind of a hoot. But I want to briefly walk through the plot and then spend a little bit of time at the end. And again, I've already been going for about 15 minutes, so I'll have to speed it up a little bit. Talk a little bit about why we should care about this. Why is this important? Why is it useful for us as consumers of history to know something about this? So, Carney takes New Mexico. The dramatis personae, the players, here are the characters. Of the 6 main characters, 2 are historical figures of a sort, or at least they're based on historical figures. One is Juan de Dios Maese, or he's listed in the radio play as Juan de Dios Maes, who was one of the founders of Las Vegas in 1835, and in 1846, he was the alcalde, the mayor of Las Vegas. So he's a historical figure. The other historical figure, Brigadier General Stephen Watts Carney, who led the expeditionary force that departed from Kansas in the late spring of 1846 and arrived in Las Vegas in mid-August. Early in the U.S.-Mexican War of 1846-1848, commencing the conquest of New Mexico, the supposedly bloodless conquest by the United States. The other 4 main characters are fictitious. The Dolores, the daughter of Juan de Dios Maese, does not seem to have been a historical figure. Carney, according to the radio play, Carney had a nephew named Robert Carney, also apparently not a real person. Carney did have a famous nephew, a man named Philip Carney, who was a Civil War general who ended up covering himself with glory during the Civil War after serving in Egypt and France and everywhere else. He was sort of a soldier of fortune. This is not him. And then the other 2 main characters are Don Feliciano Armijo, a wealthy landowner of Las Vegas, and Lorenzo, the son of Don Feliciano, the child of a wealthy landowner. Those are the 6 main characters: Carney, Maese, and then Lieutenant Carney, Dolores, and then Don Feliciano and Lorenzo. So the plot, a 1-act, 3-scene play. The first scene consists of basically laying the groundwork. In the first scene, Dolores is about to be married. She's betrothed to Lorenzo, the child of Feliciano Armijo. It's an arranged marriage, a marriage arranged between their parents, and she's not happy about it. She wants to marry for love. She doesn't love Lorenzo. She's worried about it, but agrees that she'll bend to her father's will and marry him. even though she has misgivings. So as the scene continues, Lorenzo and Don Feliciano arrive, and they have a traditional betrothal ceremony, a prendorio, in which betrothal gift is given and vows are taken preparatory to having the wedding ceremony the next day. So while that's going on, scene change. Scene 2, Stephen Watts Carney arrives at the house of the alcalde, accompanied by his nephew, Lieutenant Robert Carney, and his adjutant, another lieutenant, Lieutenant Smith, fairly generic name, not a player, doesn't have a line. Anyway, so they arrive. Carney announces to Juan de Dios Maese that the Americans are arriving and that on the morrow he's going to declare New Mexico to be part of the United States. Juan de Dios Maese surprisingly declares that he's all in favor of that, that he is welcoming of the American takeover. His daughter similarly is welcoming of the American takeover. This appalls Don Feliciano and Lorenzo, who say rather than live under American rule, they will go to Mexico. So there is a conflict. Don Feliciano demands that the wedding take place immediately so that Dolores can accompany them as they flee the Americans and go down to Mexico. Dolores says, no, I will not go. I will not marry you. She actually threatens violence if he tries to make her. So the betrothal is off. The betrothal gifts are returned, and Don Feliciano and his son depart, apparently to flee the territory and go down to Mexico. Carney withdraws, leaving his nephew behind. Carney has to, he says, go back to the troops who are up in Mora, although in the days when people were riding horses, that would be a long jog back at night to come back the next day. Anyway, but so Robert Carney, the fictitious nephew left behind, immediately falls in love with Dolores. She falls in love with him. They kiss passionately, and that ends scene 2. Scene 3 is the action shifts to the rooftop. Juan de Dios Maese, the alcalde, Stephen Watts Carney, who comes back, they go to the top of the roof, and Carney makes his famous speech in which he promises that the people will be well treated, there will be no violating of their rights, they will be protected, not a pepper, not an onion will be taken without your leave. Oh, and by the way, this is all American territory. We thought it's American territory for a long time, and it is, and you're all American citizens. But anybody who, and we're not going to ask you to fight alongside us against Mexico, but anybody who resists, I will hang. And this is, in fact, what is repeated is Carney's actual speech. And at the end of it, Carney announces that Juan de Dios Maese, the alcalde, and other officials will have to swear allegiance to the United States, and they do so, apparently with great willingness. Dolores, who has climbed up the ladder, slips and falls off the ladder, is caught in the arms of Robert Carney, the fictitious nephew of General Carney. He kisses her passionately and announces, quote, "The conquest is complete," end quote. The play ends. So that is Carney Takes New Mexico, a radio play written in 1936 based on an earlier play. So what are we to make of all this? What does this have to tell us as students of history? Well, obviously, it projects a certain image of the American conquest, one that's very much in keeping with the reenactment of the previous year. In that reenactment, people from East Las Vegas, the Anglo part of town at the time, dressed up as American soldiers, and with flags and muskets, they traveled down Bridge Street, crossed the bridge, came to the plaza, where they were greeted by Hispanic residents of Las Vegas dressed up as dons and doñas, peasants, friars, and Indians. And then an actor portraying Carney went up on top of the same roof and makes the same speech, followed by jubilation and celebration. So again, it projects this idea of a positive picture of the American conquest as one that was welcomed, at least by a lot of the inhabitants, certainly by the elite, and also the idea that the conquest was both voluntary in a sense and bloodless. The reality, as we know, is somewhat different. There was, in fact, a violent rebellion against American occupation that broke out in December of 1846 and lasted through the summer of 1847. Most of the fighting was on the other side of the mountains, from Embudo and Santa Fe all the way up to Taos, culminating in February of 1847 in an all-out assault on the rebels who had holed up in the church in Taos. But the rebellion was crushed. On this side of the mountains, led by a man named Cortes, there was a concerted rebellion in Mora, which resulted in the death of several Americans. An American military force left Las Vegas, went up to Mora, assaulted the town, was repulsed, and their commander killed. They withdrew to Las Vegas, got reinforcements, went back the next day or a couple of days later, and they leveled the town. They shelled Mora, and Mora was completely destroyed, the inhabitants forced to flee. And there were even episodes here in the Las Vegas area. And all of this was followed by significant reprisals. So it was not a bloodless reconquest. And so one has to ask, okay, well, why was this the way the conquest was represented? Clearly, it's a way of depicting the conquest to suggest that all the right people supported the American takeover and that it was peaceful and without large amounts of violence. And there are a lot of reasons for that we really don't have time to go into. But if we think about it, there are implications here for the future. I was talking to the other Dr. Linder not too long ago, actually yesterday, I think. And while we were talking, I thought of the fact that the bicentennial of the founding of Las Vegas is a scant 11 years away. In 2035, Las Vegas will be 200 years old. And so we have to ask ourselves, okay, how do we want to think about memorializing that anniversary? I am willing to bet that it will not be by reenacting in a kind of jubilant, celebratory way the American takeover of Las Vegas in 1846. And we only have to step back a little bit and look at how historical commemoration has become, in a sense, a battleground, with political skirmishes and actual violence in some cases revolving around sort of the question of Confederate monuments. Or closer to home, look at how people have begun to question the propriety of the way in which the Santa Fe fiestas celebrate a supposedly bloodless reconquest of New Mexico in the wake of the Pueblo Revolt. Or even the episodes that have taken place revolving around statues and monuments commemorating the conquest. From the sawing off of the foot of the Oñate statue in Embudo in December of 1998 to recent disturbances in Albuquerque around the Hispanic settlers monuments at the Hispanic Cultural Center, or the destruction of the Carney Monument in Santa Fe, or the vandalization of the Kit Carson Memorial or Monument in Santa Fe just September of last year. So clearly, our understanding of the past is changing, and things that were previously received as matter of course, the celebration of Columbus Day, for example, have become a bit more complicated. So I will end there with a whimper as opposed to a bang, and I will happily field any questions people may have.
Thank you, Dr. Linder. Does anyone have any questions regarding this extremely controversial yet inspirational topic? Anything in the chat here?
I had a question about this, Carol. I had a question. Maybe you could stop spotlighting now, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe, and
Thanks.
stop sharing. But anyway, I wondered about how, if you had information about how they decided who was on the committee to celebrate the Centennial.
Well, that's a good question, and again, maybe in the future I will revisit my presentation on the Centennial. I think it has the makings of an article if I ever get around to it. But the committee that organized the Centennial celebration was a large one, but it consisted mostly of sort of economic business leaders, people from the university. There was not only Lester Raines, who we've talked about as the leader of the sort of the theater group and the director of this radio play. He was also involved in the celebration, in organizing the Centennial celebration. And there was also a historian, a man named McCullough, who was on the faculty here. But it seemed like it was a pretty broad cross-section of the sort of the middle and upper class of Las Vegas. And again, while I focus primarily on the reenactment, because that was what most interested me, we have to remember that things aren't just one thing. The Centennial celebration was not just about promoting sort of hegemonic views of history. It was a tourist event. The idea was to attract tourists and promote local business at a time when the economy was in bad shape. Again, 1935, if we remember, this was the depths of the Great Depression. And so there were all kinds of things. They brought in sort of a Cherokee princess to perform Indian songs. They had a beard growing contest where prominent local people were expected to grow beards and wear red shirts and sort of reenact pioneer days. And so there were a whole bunch of things, but the centerpiece and the kind of last act of the whole thing was this reenactment. Again, not a reenactment of Juan de Dios Maese and the settlers from San Miguel coming and founding Las Vegas, but the American takeover. And again, my argument that wasn't just a random choice. I don't know if that answers your question, Dr. Linder, but
thank you. Thank you, Dr. Linder.
Thank you for your question, Dr. Carol Linder. I did a couple of hands up. Siri, would you like to go first?
Oh, well, thank you. history's always fascinating. I was just curious, with celebrating events in the future, how we can, I don't know, be more inclusive, because before, my understanding, I could be incorrect with my history, is that the Spaniards had overrun the Las Vegas area before the Americans did, but yet the Native American population actually resided in the area. So knowing our history and knowing what we want to change, how can we be more inclusive in celebration of the past, but in the future with the present? I don't know if that makes much sense, but
no, I think it does, and it raises a lot of questions. Again, I'm unfortunately, and maybe my colleague Dr. Williams can help me out on this if he has some ideas, but it's difficult because history is complicated. Mm-hmm. And when you do a public celebration, you don't necessarily want to show history warts and all, or at least there's an argument to be made that you're trying to put a positive face on it. But again, depending on how it's done, it can lead some people to feel like they are being written out of history. So that, again, the traditional Santa Fe Fiesta involved the commemoration of the supposedly bloodless reconquest of Santa Fe in 1692 by de Vargas, after a decade in which the Spanish had been expelled and the pueblos were again independent. And so in recent years, that's called into question because the reconquest was not bloodless. The initial return of de Vargas in 1692 was relatively peaceful, but the following year, when the Spanish settlers returned, there was rebellion, there was fighting, there were reprisals. So again, it takes us back to this question of how do we want to remember the past? What I will say from my perspective, and again, take this for what it's worth, my opinion, probably not that much, but if we're going to do a reenactment, it has to be nuanced. It has to show at least some of the warts, some of the blemishes, so that people have a clear understanding of how we got from there to where we are today. So again, rather than lionizing an Oñate or a Coronado, and again, in doing some of the research for this talk and for earlier talks, one of the things that's happening at about this same time, or right around this same time, was that people were gearing up to the Cuatro Centenario, for this 400 years anniversary of the Coronado expedition, 1540 to 1542. And when that was carried out in 1940, you can bet it was positive. It was, glorifying the Spanish. If we see another one, 16 years in the future, I have a feeling it's going to be very different, because the indigenous peoples of New Mexico, the successors of the peoples who were here circa 1540, are going to insist. So I think having observances that are more inclusive has to start with a couple of understandings. One is that everybody has their own perspective on history, and that we should not prioritize one over the other. Or at least, again, that's my opinion. You will get other opinions in other quarters. The other thing to keep in mind is that we are not the people who lived 400 years ago, or even 100 years ago. So one of the things that and again, I'm speaking personally here, want to try to make sure of is that we do not visit the sins of the fathers, so to speak, on their descendants living today. point to someone and say, well, your ancestors killed my ancestors and therefore I hate you, or you don't have a place in this area, I think is problematic, and it's ahistorical. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Dr. Linder. Ms. Elena, I believe you were next, and then Mr. Williams, Regent Garcia, I thought you had your hand up, and then we'll go to Mr. Romero.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Linder. I'm